as you can see, this Jadus test bike here is coming along nicely. I think I'm going to turn this into somewhat of a street tracker eventually. You can see we've got the Jadus seat on, tail loop kit, tail light bracket, and then a new smaller tail light, some mini blinkers front and rear. I've lowered it, lifted the stanchions up through the triple tree, got some prototype clip-on handlebars here, some riser handlebars, special riser clip-ons which I'm thinking about taking into production. I'll just have to see how that goes. And you can see we've got the Jadus header on and an adjusted carburetor to suit. And this clip here, we're actually going to install the Jadus front fork stabilizer, and what that does is it stiffens up the front end and gives you a lot of stability and a lot more confidence in handling and things like that. So there's a few ways we can adjust the stock guard to make that fit, or we can actually install a Jadus universal front guard, which is what I'll do in this case, but I'll show you how to do it in all cases if you do want to adjust the stock guard and make that work. So I'll give you a highlight, a little clip of the product itself, and then we'll get into the installation. So here we have the contents of the kit, and the brackets themselves are actually CNC machined from billet aluminium, and they are made from 6061 T6 aluminium. And to the outer sides here we have some metal shim, and what that does is that takes up any tolerance differences in the Yamaha fork tubes, because that can vary a little from the factory, as can these brackets themselves. So on the left side here we have some shims that are made from stainless that are 0.05 mil thick, and on the right side we have some shims that are 0.1 mil thick. So depending on the tolerances of the actual fork tubes on your bike, that will decide which you will need to use. In some cases you might not need to use either of them. In the middle we have these small plastic pom spacers, and what that does is if your guard is already sitting quite high, you can lift this whole kit up by a few millimeters to get some more clearance if needed. And then finally we have some stainless steel hex drive bolts that pull everything together. So we have two in the rear and two in the front, and you actually only end up with two being visible from the front side. But that's the contents of the kit, so I'll show you how to install that now. Okay, here we can see that the front guard, the stock front guard position, actually sits higher than the top of the fork tubes here. So the fork brace will not fit in stock form, but we have a couple of options if you want to retain the stock guard, if you like it. And you can see here, especially down at the rear here, how much clearance there is between the tyre and the guard itself. So that leaves us with two options, and that is that we can remove the front guard and reposition the mounting holes here further up, and that lowers the guard down closer to the tyre. You'll still end up with plenty of clearance, and then you have room for the fork brace to fit above the guard. It's one option. The second option is to remove the guard and trace an outline here to trim a new guard, a new form, a new shape from the stock guard, including trimming off the sides here, and then actually mount that to the fork brace, because you can see on the fork brace we have mounting holes for doing that. So what I'll do is I'll show you how to do both methods, and then in the end I'm actually going to install the Jadus aluminium front guard. Okay, here we can see I've removed the bolts for the guard on both sides, and then I've pushed the guard down so that I have enough clearance here for the fork brace, and then still plenty of tyre clearance here underneath the guard. And what I'll do is I'll take a pen, a marker, and I'll mark here the centre line of the attachment point for the bolts onto the guard, and then that's where I'm going to drill some new holes to be able to relocate the position of this guard. And then I'll trim off this bracket here so that the bottom of it now finishes at the bottom of this bracket here on the stanchion tube. So from those previous process photos you can see the end result here. Bolts in their new position, clearance for the fork brace and clearance for the tyre here too. So if you wanted to, this could be the end result, and then you can skip to the front or the end of the video and I'll show you how to install the brace now. But at this point I'm actually going to do the second variation where I trim the bracket up, and I'll show you some tricks how to do that, and then attach the guard to the fork brace itself. So now with the guard on, you can see I've placed some tape on the guard where I put my marks in order to be able to know where to trim it later. And in some countries there's legal requirements for how far you can actually trim it and what is legal and what is not. From my understanding, in most places it's 90 degrees straight up from the front axle and then 45 from the back, roughly, give or take. And this is also up to personal taste on how much you want to trim it and what look you're sort of going for. So I'll show you a clip on how I'm actually going to be able to trim this and maintain a symmetrical curve at the front and the rear of the guard when we trim it up. So before we start sketching in our curve for trimming, I recommend you make a paper template. And with this template, because of the curvature and because paper's flexible, you can measure the start and end point on either side of the guard, and then take the distance here and divide it by 2, and you end up with a midpoint. And then what you're going to be able to do is draw a center line or a mirror line all the way through where you're going to trim the guard, and that will allow us to have a better chance of getting a symmetrical cut. So I'm going to mark that up now. So now I have my center line marked in, and I'm going to sketch in the curve that I like, or that I want, across here for the trimming operation. And this is very much up to personal taste. Some people like a rather square cut, sort of a stubby look. Some people like more of a curve, more like the stock, and others like something in between. So I'm going to sketch up something that I like on one side, and then we'll make a template to mirror that onto the other side. So I've sketched in the curve that I want, and then I've gone ahead and made a paper template that I made so that it matches the symmetry line and then follows the curve of the line that I drew. And what we'll be able to do then is transfer that curve to the other side so that we mirror the line and end up with symmetry in our cut. So I'll mark that out, show what it looks like, trim it up, do the same for front and rear, and then we'll move on with the process. Okay, and this is the end result of the trimming. So you can see we've got symmetric edges, both front and rear, and we've trimmed off the sides as well. And when we trimmed off the sides, we actually lost the reinforcement bracket, which is fine in this case. It used to sit there, but that also means that this guard is now a lot lighter than the stock one. So you've lost weight on your bike, and that's always a good thing. So we'll go through the next process of installing this onto the brackets, the fork brace on the bike. So before installing the brace, we can determine if you want to use these plastic spaces that are provided with the kit, if you want to use them or not. And what that does is it provides some extra clearance if you have a really fat tyre on. Right at the moment this is a stock tyre, so it's a 90/90 19 inch. But if you have a fatter tyre that comes up higher, you may need to use these spaces to get a little bit of extra clearance when you install the fork brace, and that's going to lift it up a few extra millimeters, and you can see here you get more clearance underneath it. It's not going to affect the gripping force on the inside of the fork brace onto the fork tubes at all. So that's just a pointer here. If you have a fatter tyre and you want more clearance, that's what these spaces are for. But otherwise, and especially in this case, I'm not going to use them at all. So when you install the brace, you want to place the front piece on first, and that should slide in or position in relatively easy. And then you set in 2 of the attachment screws, and come in with the rear, and that should also slide into the pace and meet up with the screws, which you then screw in. And you can screw these in tight, evenly on both sides, And don't worry about the rear screws yet, we'll put them in last. So once you have this in place, we can actually start getting a feeling for the tolerances of the fork tubes. So I'm going to tighten these up until the fork brace is completely together, and you'll see that the part line here has pulled in together. And once that's done up tight, you can see if it's holding in place like this one is, then you won't need any of the shims. But if you can lift this up with your hands, even when those screws are tight, it means we'll have to use some of the shims that are provided in the kit, and I'll show you how to install them now. So even though in this case, on this bike, I don't actually need the shims because the fit was really good, I'm showing you how to do this in the case that your bike does need them. So what you can see is I've taken the 0.05mm thick shims and placed them on either side of the forks. And what I've done is I've wrapped them around the fork and then held them in place with a thin piece of tape. And that tape shouldn't upset any of the fitment or anything, because if you use nice thin clear tape, it won't be a problem at all. So once we have that in place, we grab our fork brace again and do like just as we did before. It should rest on the top and then slide into place. We'll do that with the front and rear, and then as we did before, we'll screw the screws in from the front first here and then in the rear. So I'll do that now, and then I'm going to point out a tip that I recommend but you don't have to do, and that is to add some removable thread locker. So once you have your brace in place and you've screwed in the screws front and rear, 2 on either side, I recommend you back out the screws 1 at a time, and the brace will hold in place, and then add a drop of 2 of removable thread locker onto the thread, and then screw it back in place. And it's really important that it's removable, otherwise if you use permanent thread locker, the bolt's going to hold in place, and when you go to remove it, or someone else goes to remove it if you sell the bike, they're going to strip the threads out entirely and ruin the brace. So it's important that it's removable thread locker, and this is up to you. It depends on how much your bike vibrates and if the bolts, if you feel like there's a risk of them coming loose, but this is something that I would recommend. Now the fork brace is entirely installed, and as Ichiban Motor would say, this looks pretty badass, and this is mostly what street trackers would have, because when you add a front guard it sort of removes some of the racing look. And if you live in a country that has a friendlier riding climate than Sweden, say for example California or Spain or Portugal, then you may not need a front guard at all, because hopefully it doesn't rain so often and you might not have to ride in the rain at all. But if you live in a country like Sweden or somewhere else where there's a lot of rain, you'll probably want a front guard. So I'll show you how to install the stock one that we've trimmed up all nicely, and then also the Jadus universal one. So first of all, we're going to decide just whereabouts we want the guard to sit. If we want it quite far back and stubby at the front, or right balanced in the middle, or the other way around. And we're going to mark, once you decide where you want it, mark the front edge and the rear edge, and then we'll take the guard out and mark where we're going to drill these 2 holes here for the mounting hardware. So I'm actually going to prepare the Jadus guard at the same time that I prepare the stock one, and I've marked out the front and rear edge of the fork brace where I want the guard positioned on the wheel. I'm going to remake another center line finder template and then mark a center line, so I end up with a center line through both guards here. And I'm also going to mark out the center between these 2 points. So I'll measure that, divide it by 2, and then run across. And what I'll end up with is a cross here for me to then measure out where I'll need to drill the holes to be able to attach it to the fork brace. So I've marked out my center lines on both guards. And now we have a center point for measuring out where we need to drill the holes. And the hole spacing on the fork brace is 30mm. So if we take a measurement 15mm either side and drill our holes there, that's going to allow us to line this up with the fork brace and screw it in place. Here's what the guard should look like once you've drilled the holes. So we measured out 15mm from the centre mark that we made, punched a starter with a centre punch, and drilled up these holes here to 6.5mm, which is a clearance hole for an M6 bolt, which is what we're going to use to attach this to the fork brace. When we attach the guard, whether it be the stock one, the modified one, or the Jadus one, you're probably going to want to use some nice looking fastenings, some hardware. So I like these M6 button head bolts. And then you're going to want a nice large washer for the underneath of the guard to get a nice big surface area to hold it in place, and then probably even I'm going to use a locking washer as well, so those combined. And then the next thing you're probably wanting to do is to isolate the vibrations in some way, and you can do that with these rubber grommets through the guard, or I'm actually going to cheat a little bit and use some rubber O-rings, and that is just going to break the surface contact from the fork brace to the guard and hopefully isolate some vibrations, and then we won't send those vibrations through the mounting point and risk cracks. So I leave that decision up to you, but in this case I'm just going to use these O-rings. And with that mounting hardware in place, we can see we've now got the stock guard all bolted down and in position, and it looks pretty cool, all trimmed up like that. Now I'll put the Jadus one on. And now is the Jadus guard installed, which looks pretty schmick. Well, thanks for tuning in to another Jadus installation video. I hope you like the result of installing the fork brace here, and either if you modified the stock guard or installed the Jadus guard, I hope you like the look of that. I'd just like to close with a couple of extra tips. In this installation here, I actually did end up using the spacers that lifted the fork brace up a little, and that was so I had room to get a nut underneath the attachment bolts there. So in your case that you might need those as well. It wasn't necessarily clearance for the wheel, but it was more clearance to actually be able to get a nut underneath there. And you might have noticed the finish on the guard. It's a brushed look. The guard, when we sell them, doesn't come like that. It's a finish that I've done myself by hand, just with some sandpaper of different grades, and it's quite easy actually to get a relatively even look, because I didn't like the look of the polished guard or the flat guard on this particular bike, and I didn't really want to paint it either. So the brush look really suits this build here. Next up, we'll be installing the tank leveling kit on this, and that's sort of going to complete the look of the bike, I hope. And then later down the track, I'll be using some Jadus stainless spokes and relacing these wheels up to some aluminium rims. We're going to save some weight, and we will put some more dirt trackish looking tyres on. And then there's a couple of other things that we'll do to finish off the bike, but by the time we're done, this is going to look pretty custom. So yeah, as always, thanks for your support, and happy wrenching and happy riding. Cheers.